Hi, welcome to another In Conversation with at Braintree Museum. My name's Claire Willits. I'm the Collections and Exhibitions Curator. And in 2019 and 2020, we did a lot of research about the Courtauld women in particular, something we've not really explored before with their stories. And I'm joined here today with one of our volunteers, Vicky Geddes, who helped with that research. And we're going to talk about Dr. Elizabeth Courtauld, who was an inspiring medical professional at the turn of the century. Vicky, can you tell me a little bit about who Elizabeth Courtauld was and how she fits within the Courtauld family?
Yeah, she's kind of sitting in that middle branch of the Courtauld family. She's one of the 13 children that George Courtauld III had. So she's born in roughly the middle of the 19th century in 1867. The first sort of 20 or so years of her life are really pretty typical for someone who was of her social background. But when she turned 21, she sort of broke away from the mold that women kind of in her family were often playing, and she decided to go into medicine. So she trained to be a nurse. She later qualified to be a doctor. And then she went overseas and spent pretty much her entire working life partly in India, and then also on the front lines in World War I, working at a hospital in France. Yeah, so she's a really, really interesting woman. Obviously, many of the Courtauld ladies sort of break the mold to a certain extent, but she very much just sort of takes herself off and decides that this is what she wants to do with her life and sort of just never looks back.
Do you think her family were supportive of that desire she had to follow a medical career?
Well, obviously she's got an exceedingly large family, and we don't really know what the family as a whole kind of saw and what they thought of her. But the thing that we do know is that her father certainly did not approve. She had gone to Germany in her early 20s because her father was remarrying and she did not approve of his marriage. So she basically decided that instead she was going to go off to Germany for a little while. She did some kind of courses just studying nursing, and when she came back she told her father that she wanted to go into medicine, and he made it pretty clear that it was not something that he thought his daughter should be doing. Obviously we don't necessarily know why this was. It's possibly because it was still slightly unusual for women to be going particularly into training to be a doctor, but I suspect it was probably more because of his view of their social situation. The Courtauld family by this point are pretty well established. They're reasonably well known and high ranking, and I think from her father's point of view, people in his family built hospitals, they didn't go and work in them. So she clearly just didn't really care that her father disapproved. She was clearly a very strong-minded woman, and she just decided that she was going to go and train because that's what she wanted to do, and just sort of, I would say, turned away from her family, but did her own thing for the entirety of her life.
Just to put into context, so her father was George III, George Courtauld III, and he then later became, in the 1870s, I believe it is, the MP for Morden. So it was quite involved in local politics. We know from some letters we've got in the museum collection that he was very involved in the running of the company as well. So he wouldn't have necessarily expected her to go and work for the company at all by any stretch, but perhaps even just the fact she was going out to work was perhaps.
I think that's the thing. He's in the public view. He's an elected official, and I think he was perhaps quite aware of how people might perceive anything that his family did. So yeah, he's the businessman, he's the politician, and in her earlier life she was just, a very typical woman that he would have expected her to be. And I think her then deciding that she was going to be what she wanted, and like you say, the fact that she was going to work, that she was doing something that's very physical, it's not a genteel, ladylike profession. She's in the dirt, in the blood, in the horror of the war, and she's over in India and things like that. So she's very much a world away from what he would have expected. one of his children to be doing.
Absolutely, a world away from North Essex, certainly.
Absolutely.
So we've got here a photograph of her as a doctor in World War I on the front line. Can you tell us a bit about how she ended up on the front line in World War I on the Western Front?
Yeah, I mean, it's a story that begins with her training to be a medical professional. As I say, she'd caught the bug for wanting to help people and go into nursing and things like that when she was a really young woman. She ended up training at the London School of Medicine for Women and qualified as a doctor in 1901. After a couple of years in England, she had gone out to India and had decided that that was somewhere that she wanted to apply herself. It was perhaps a bit more freeing for her as a woman. She didn't have so many restrictions that she was facing practicing in England. While she was studying at the London School of Medicine, she was there with a lady called Frances Ivans, and she was, along with other women, was starting a hospital called the Scottish Women's Hospital, and they were creating a base in Royaumont, forgive my pronunciation, in France. And they basically invited women to come and join their unit. It was an all-female group of doctors and surgeons and administrators and orderlies and everything. And so it's presumably because of their knowing each other while they were still studying that she was invited to come and join this group. And they were, when we say on the front lines, they were really on the front lines. They were like 25 miles away, roughly, from where people were being shot. So Royaumont was the first port of call for a lot of these men, boys, you know, all these soldiers, really.
And this photograph here, it shows her with the youngest doctor that was based at the hospital there. And she herself, I believe, was the eldest doctor there, and she performed the role as an anaesthetist, and she was really well thought of, and a lot of the testimony that her colleagues write about is really, really descriptive. I was just going to share one of the quotes that's written in some of the research that we did about her, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So it says, in times of stress, when a convoy of badly wounded arrived, we had to work in the operating theatre without let up until all the work was done. Elizabeth Courtauld was our chief anaesthetist, and she could outstrip many of the young colleagues when they visibly tired after long hours. And she was recognised, she soon made her way into all our hearts by her kindness, her understanding, her unselfishness, her sense of humour, and above all, her simplicity. So she obviously brought a huge value to that hospital environment.
Yeah, she's clearly an incredibly remarkable woman, and she's obviously someone who's not shying away from the really awful conditions that they could be working in. She wrote about a night where she was performing amputations alongside all the other women, and because there was very intermittent, if any, electricity in the hospital, they only had kind of the ends of candles to work by, and she wrote that she herself was doing her work more or less completely in the dark, and obviously she was just completely unfazed by that, and it was the job that needed to be done, and so that's what she did. And I think that a lot of the other people who were working there must have massively respected her for that kind of attitude of, you know, just get the job done, and you're there to help people, and that's exactly what she was doing. I mean, as like going back to those quotes, different things people have written about her, there's one that I really like, which is she looked like an old lady. She had white hair and she had these little gold spectacles, but for someone who looked so frail, she was an absolute tower of strength. Just because obviously, like you say, she just had the stamina to just keep going for hours and hours and hours, and just would never, you know, she never had the fact that she was an older lady holding her back. It was absolutely, she was just one of these people who was doing this incredible work.
And she was certainly recognised, and we're going to struggle with our French pronunciation here again, aren't we? Which she was given, she was awarded the Croix de Guerre, which is a French war medal for her achievements and her contribution based at the hospital. And I think what's fascinating is that the hospital itself was run entirely by women as well. So she was one amongst many other women. And I don't know whether in some ways it makes it more remarkable that she came from such a wealthy family or not, because she didn't have to choose that lifestyle. She chose it, and that makes it slightly more remarkable. But certainly she made a huge contribution. Can you, obviously she was there for the duration of the war. What did she do after the war? Did she return to Essex, or did she go back?
So she does eventually return to Essex, but it's not the first thing that she does. So in fact, all of the staff are based at Royaumont for several months after the war had ended. Not obviously entirely sure what they were doing, perhaps just packing down the hospital, but she was there until March of 1919. Once she had finished in France, she actually went back to Bangalore in India, which is where she'd been working before she got sort of brought into this unit of women. And she clearly had a very strong affinity with Bangalore, perhaps because she felt that there was a lot more work that needed to be done that she hadn't finished. So she goes back to India, and she was there for the rest of her working life, really. So she stayed in India until around about 1927. So she'd have retired when she was around 60. And at that point, she then came back to Essex. Apparently she'd adopted one of a dog that had been left at the hospital in France, that had been sort of the mascot of the hospital, and so he was kind of her companion for as long as he lived. But yeah, in the 1920s she comes back to Essex. She settles back pretty much, where her family are all living. Obviously I don't know how much she then interacted with her family once she was back in the county, but she stayed in Essex until she died in 1947, just after she turned 80. So
she had a good long life then, didn't she?
Yeah, she had a good long life. She very much got a lot done. She had a pretty remarkable legacy, I think. But I mean, she's often, I would say, overlooked, but she's not necessarily the first Courtauld that you think of. She's sort of an appendix at the end of the chapter, because she did all this remarkable stuff, but it's so a world away from what everyone else was doing. And while many of the Courtauld women, they help people and they use their position of privilege for good, she absolutely went that kind of extra mile, because she essentially turns away from this privileged life that she had been experiencing, and she just decided to dedicate her entire life to helping others and doing good. And I think it's an absolutely incredible legacy to have left behind.
It's a really remarkable story that I think is not really necessarily known locally in Braintree district and Essex.
I mean, as a whole, like the French hospital just wasn't ever really recognised by the British after the war had ended. So this massive hospital of women is not really known about, and I think it's so surprising. I mean, like, they were so close to the front lines, and during the Battle of the Somme they were working for like 8 consecutive days on 16 hours of sleep and stuff. And it seems we should know much more about Elizabeth Courtauld, and we should be remembering her as one of these incredible Essex women, and she's just sort of somehow slightly slipped out of the radar, and I think it's such a shame, because she's just remarkable.
She certainly is. Well, hopefully by this project we've been doing at the museum, we're hoping to raise her profile a bit more.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
That's been the aim anyway.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Vicky. Thank you for sharing with us your thoughts of Dr. Elizabeth.
Any excuse to talk about her, because I think she's really cool.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.